welcome everybody. Great to have you here with us today. This is the today's segment in our MIT Sloan Executive Education Innovation at Work webinar series. And as many of you probably have been with us before, this is where we take a deep dive into a topic of great import at the intersection of management and technology. And today we are going to talk about generative artificial intelligence, AI, or something that I think most of us probably know more commonly as ChatGPT, which burst onto the scene last fall. And I think by all indicators, it seems to be one of those technologies that can be truly disruptive and creative. And so there's a great deal of interest in that. Obviously, you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in it, so happy to have you. We are delighted to have with us here today two experts in technology strategy from the MIT faculty. We have Pierre Azoulay, who is the International Programs Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And we also have Ezra Zuckerman, who is the Alvin Siteman Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship. Pierre and Ezra co-teach our executive education program on developing technology strategy. And so we couldn't think of two better people to take on this issue of generative AI, and particularly how some of the biggest technology companies in the world right now are dealing with this and looking to gain competitive advantage. And so Pierre and Ezra are going to put a technology strategy lens on this topic. We're going to talk about the framework of value creation, value capture, and value delivery, which is really at the core of how we think about tech strategy here. And I'm delighted to turn it over to Pierre to start in with our webinar today.
All right. Thank you, Eric, for this very kind introduction. Thanks for everyone for connecting from a really wide number of places around the world. Ezra and I have been teaching this class for, I think, more than 10 years now. And we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of illustrate some of the themes that run through this class, using as a thread the current battle for generative AI. And so here is how I'd like to set the scene, right? So this is a research paper that was published by the Google Brain team in 2017. It was called Attention is All You Need, and it introduced the now famous transformer architecture that you can see illustrated on the right. And everyone who's anyone in the world of AI right now seem to have kind of switched and adopted that architecture. Lots of companies started training massive transformers on really large amounts of data, and they began to call those models large language models, or LLMs, right? OpenAI came along with ChatGPT on November 30th, 2022. The first LLM-based chatbot, but it's worth mentioning that in a different domain, DeepMind introduced AlphaFold for protein structure prediction, which also uses a transformer architecture, right? One might note as well that ChatGPT or OpenAI missed the opportunity to call their large language model Large March, which would have been a much funner name for it. Okay, so this is what happened, right? And the question is, how do we make sense of this? And what do we think is going to happen in the marketplace and the industry, right? And so the way we think about technology strategy is that we think that this rests for any particular organization on three pillars: value creation, value capture, and value delivery, right? So in other words, you need to be able to answer three key questions. What kind of value are you going to create for your customers? And in technology intensive industry, that in some sense means aligning your investments in developing a technology with your understanding of the marketplace and of customer needs. So that's the value creation part, right? The second question is, are you going to be able to capture any of that value that you've created in the face of competition, right? And then the last set of questions is, can you actually do it? Can you actually execute? Can you actually implement this strategy? Do you have the organizational capabilities to deliver what you promised? And so we are going to divide this webinar in 3 different segments of discussion that roughly are going to map into each of those bubbles, right? And I want to begin with value creation. And so I just told you that value creation is about aligning or managing the coevolution of technologies and markets. So let's think about technology first, right? And I want to introduce a tool that is a very useful heuristic for managers to kind of map the development of any particular technological trajectory, okay? And so what you have here is a curve that maps R&D effort or innovation effort in any particular domain against some metric of technical efficiency, right? And so it's really important that here we're not talking about the marketplace, right? We're talking about engineers noodling around in the lab and thinking about how can we push this technology further, right? And the story is that for most technologies, the way it begins is very slowly, okay? You're investing a ton and you're not making a lot of progress because fundamentally you don't know what you're doing. There are lots of failed experiments and blind alleys and 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and so on and so forth. At some point, though, you hit on an insight, on a really important insight. You have a moment of clarity. You realize something, and that's this inflection. This is the inflection point on this curve, right? This is what allows takeoff. Often we call this the moment of dominant design, right? And then everything that happens after that is in some sense an elaboration of the dominant design. And having a dominant design allows you to make a ton of progress without necessarily investing a lot of money. But at some point, the dominant design becomes a straitjacket for further elaboration of the technology, and this is when you start hitting this era of maturity. You're kind of plateauing. You're investing a lot, but not necessarily making a lot of progress. Okay, so how do we think about this framework in the context of generative AI? So the way I think about it, and there are probably other ways to think about it, is that the S-curve here, right, it's not ChatGPT, and it's not even the transformer architecture, right? It's deep learning. And deep learning is a particular approach to doing artificial intelligence that is in some sense quite old. And for a long time, in the world of artificial intelligence was kind of in a state of semi-disrepute, right? People didn't think it was going to work. And starting in the mid-1990s, it started getting popularity again. So the era of ferment here, in fact, lasted for a very long time. And the measure of technical efficiency is, this is a technology for prediction. So we're trying to predict something. So you can think about the measure of technical efficiency as the quality of our predictions in some sense, right? And I think what happened with what happened in 2018 with the transformer architecture is that we got our moment of dominant design, right? We had the flash of genius. We had the moment of clarity. We had the arrival of a particular approach, of a particular implementation of these deep learning algorithms, such that everything that came after that, in some sense, zeroed in on that approach to the exclusion of other approaches, right? And this is really true across the board. This is true for OpenAI. This is true for Google. This is true for Facebook. This is true for DeepMind. This is true for Midjourney, right? All those all those large models, they're not necessarily large language models, right? Midjourney is about graphics and pictures, but all those large models have at their heart a transformer architecture, right? And so the moment of dominant design, has arrived. Now we are now post-dominant design. We are in this very fast takeoff phase. And one thing we might have in the back of our mind is to think about, okay, when is it that we're going to get maturity, right? How much are we going to be in this takeoff phase? When are we going to start to plateau? I think it's fair to say that as of today, there's no evidence of a plateau, right? Some people think that we're going to, augmented general intelligence, and there is no plateau. The future is super intelligence, and we should be all very, very scared of that, right? That's kind of one view. And, other views are kind of a little bit more moderate, right? So that's, I think, what we could say about the development of the technology itself, right? But then you need to start thinking about how that maps against market needs. And to think about that, we have a second S-curve, right? It looks superficially the same, but the x-axis and the y-axis are different. Here we are mapping the cumulative share of potential adopters in the space against time, right? And this is a very, very well documented fact in most instances of technological development, right? And what's interesting here is that we are probably, in some sense, at a much lower level of that particular S-curve, right? We're just at the beginning. A lot of the people who might be using generative AI technology are not yet using it, right? I think that one often noticed challenge, right, for companies introducing a new technology is what's called the chasm, meaning the phenomenon that what early adopters value and what mainstream users value are not necessarily the same thing. And that creates this gap where very often it's actually really hard to make a particular technology transition to the mainstream, right? So that's why crossing the chasm is this really big challenge, especially for startups. Right? One advice that we always give our students here at MIT is that you really need to choose your customer. You really need to think about who exactly you are serving, and that there are real risks involved in trying to pursue too many customers at the same time. And what I find kind of interesting in some sense is that OpenAI, Google, and Meta, the big tech companies, they're actually not really following that advice right now, right? They have sought to provide very general models, right? And the question is that okay? They seem to think it is. Maybe there's a danger here that those really large models are going to become curiosity for academics, but in some sense, maybe they will fail to enter the mainstream, right? On the other hand, maybe keeping it open this way, keeping it very general means that they can acquire a lot of information about the most important use cases and then try to specialize to different customers later on, right? Startups, on the other hand, in this space are much more focused on narrower applications, right? So for example, there are any number of startups thinking about how to design chatbots for customer relationship management, right? But even that leaves a lot of space to think about who the customer for that chatbot is, right? There is one version of the world where I'm selling a chatbot to a company who's going to use it to augment the productivity of its existing salespeople, right? And then there's another approach where instead of thinking about augmenting the existing employee, I'm trying to create a chatbot to circumvent the human employee, to replace the human employee, right? And the point is that those are two different types of customers if you're a startup, right? Those are two different types of product offering. One is not necessarily better than the other, but that they are very different. And in some sense, failing to choose clearly between those two approaches, right? That is in some sense the thing that we would criticize as academics working in this space, right? I have on the left here something that is definitely predates the world of AI, which is this ad, which I particularly love, Pratt's Healing Ointment for Man and Beast. We both use it, right? I'm using this ad as an example of what not to do, right? There's a sense in which insisting of making the product here for Man and Beast guarantees that it's going to be inferior for both Man and Beast. Okay.
Pierre, before you go to value capture, just two quick questions here. I think there's one just on how this new architecture depends on underlying base, Web3 in particular. I'm not sure that's maybe outside of our scope, but the other one is curiosity about where are we on the S curve as far as deep learning is concerned today. I think you were basically saying we don't know. We know we have some confidence about dominant design, but beyond that, it's anybody's guess as how long and far it extends. But you can
right. That's exactly
same thing about the where are we in the S curve of the marketplace. So the one thing I would add on the S curve of the marketplace is I think we've seen, the virality of the take up of ChatGPT is pretty remarkable compared to the take up of almost any predecessor technology that you can compare it with, if that's fair.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think the one thing we can say in terms of the tech S curve is that the fact that we're seeing every new endeavor in this space using the transformer architecture tells us something about we are post takeoff. We are past the inflection point, right? How far up we are, right, past the inflection point, I think that's this is still much up in the air. And I guess the thing that I would say is, the thing that I find interesting in some sense is that I think we are past the inflection point for the tech S curve, but I don't think we are past the inflection point for the market S curve. Even though things are going really, really fast, I think there are very vast swath of both corporate users and individual consumers, right, who live in blissful oblivion of all those development. Right?
And Pierre, I would say there's a depth of adoption that a curve like that doesn't get to. So the fact that you may have downloaded ChatGPT and played around with it is not the same thing as,
incorporating it in your workflow on a daily basis.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. So my sense, in some sense, is that what's interesting, right, is that we kind of have a misalignment. The technology is running far ahead of the conceptualization of user needs, right? To some extent, for now, it's very often kind of a technology looking for problems to solve, right?
Yeah. So you should go to value capture, but it reminds me of the early ads for the personal computer, which was there was Charlie Chaplin walking around with like towers of disks, trying to convince people there was stuff you could do with it. Right, it was the computing power was there, and people didn't know what that it was actually useful for them.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I like this analogy, Ezra, because eventually they were right. Eventually Charlie Chaplin was correct, right? And I think this might be
the killer apps, word processing, spreadsheets, etc., were invented and deployed and elaborated.
Right.
And,
Right. Right now, I'm afraid that the killer app is might be our kids using the technology to write essays.
Our kids, meaning our students at MIT, right?
Or maybe even closer to home.
I should let you go on to value capture. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So the second segment of discussion, I want to think about value capture, right? So let's stipulate that this is kind of a big invention, right? There's a lot that we can do. It has the potential of augmenting the productivity and the utility of consumers and employees alike, right? Does this necessarily mean that the companies who have introduced that technology will get to profit from it, right? And in general, we think that the answer to this is no. I mean, it can, but it doesn't have to be, right? There's no necessary alignment between value creation and value capture. And so what we do in our course is to help you think, in a systematic way about the forces that shape the ways in which we can bring value creation and value capture in closer alignment. And there are basically two key ideas that we play with, right? The first one is what we call appropriability, right? what that means is, can you actually control the knowledge that is generated by your innovation? Can you control it? Can you keep it for yourself, right? Can you keep it for yourself, or decide the terms along which it is going to be actually incorporated into others' uses, right? So that's the first idea. Can you control it? The second idea is complementary assets, right? Whether or not you can control it, can you actually control the assets that are necessary to exploit the knowledge that is generated by this new idea you have brought to the world? So that's a little bit abstract. And in some sense, we have a great setting here to think about those two issues. So the first thing I wanted to say is, what do we mean about control, right? And let's go back. Let's think about, technology from 20 years ago. Let's think about Google's search platform, right? And here is the paradox. There is a sense in which the rough outlines of how the Google search platform works, both on the search side and on the advertising side, that's kind of in a public domain. The PageRank algorithm for search and the generalized second price auction for advertisements, it's kind of well understood. The broad contours of it are broadly understood, right? And yet, right, it is not the case that Google and Bing are kind of symmetric competitors, right? Google has the vast, overwhelming share of the marketplace, right? So in spite of the contours of the idea being, in some sense, in the public domain, it has still been the case that Google has been kind of far in advance of the competition here, right? Which tells you something, which tells you that when we think about controlling the technology, we're not talking about controlling the overall look and feel. We're also talking about controlling the detailed implementation of that idea, right? And so what does that mean in the context of generative AI, right? So what's interesting is that OpenAI, despite its name, has kind of decided to close things down in a pretty dramatic fashion, right? They've decided to release much less information about their particular architecture than had been the case in the past, right? So I refer you to this technical report for GPT-4, given both the competitive landscape and the safety implications of large-scale models like GPT-4. This report contains no further details about the architecture, including model size, hardware, training compute, dataset construction, training method, or similar, right? You might make a joke that OpenAI is not really open, except that it's a little bit unfair because they make it possible for you. They make it possible for everyone, right, to try their technology, right? So that's a form of openness. But on the other hand, they don't want you to look under the hood, right? They don't want to make it possible for you to do that, right? Now, what happened recently, very recently, right, about 2 months ago, is that Meta/Facebook was working on a powerful AI language model, very similar in spirit to ChatGPT, and that model was leaked online. That model is called Llama, right? And it leaked online, and so then suddenly people could look under the hood of not ChatGPT, but a very similar model, also using the transformer architecture, right? And what that has unleashed is a ton of open source efforts, right? Basically, people have remixed Facebook's model, right? And created new versions that far exceed the capability of their original, right? So kind of like, after Llama has come Alpaca and Vicuña, right? To keep in, so there's a theme here about, wild animals of the south of the Andes. And so Alpaca and Vicuña are open source projects, right? And basically what it looks like, and maybe you should take this with a grain of salt, because it's not like those results are validated, but the point is that it looks like those open source models are starting to get pretty close to the offerings of the big tech players in this space, Bard, which is the Google large language models, and ChatGPT, which is the open AI large language models, right? Now, I should say that the way in which we evaluate these models one against the other, that is subject to a lot of vigorous discussion. So this is why I think you should take those numbers with a grain of salt. But at the same time, I think what seems to be true is that these open source models, which use much fewer resources and are trained on much, much smaller budgets, seem to be getting a lot closer, a lot faster to the state of the art than maybe we could have thought, right? And this has led someone at Google to sound the alarm, right? Basically claiming we have no moat and neither does OpenAI, right? So the conventional wisdom right now is that it's going to be very hard to assert control over this technology, right? Appropriability is going to be very hard. But this is only one half of the equation of value capture. There's another thing that we need to think about, which is the value of complementary assets, right? So complementary assets here are those assets necessary to translate an innovation into commercial returns, right? So they could be manufacturing assets, they could be distribution assets, they could be complementary technologies, right? And the question is, in generative AI, what are examples of complementary assets, right? That might be controlled tightly by some players and not others. And so I would say that this is an area of active research for us. And I think that those things are still up in the air, right? Things are happening very, very fast. This is my thinking as of this moment, but as more data comes in and as more instances of competitive racing arrive in this space, I may well be led to revise my view, right? My sense, though, is that there are two types of complementary assets that might be relevant here. The first might be what we might call data moats, meaning that you might be able to differentiate for a long run your large language models, right, relative to other large language models if you really have access to some unique source of data to train your model on, right? So for large language model, that may never be the case, right? There might be enough data in the public domain that it's never the case that you're going to have kind of private sources of data that allows you to get a lead. But I think in other domains such as photos and videos, that may not be the case, right? Already we see that some of the rights owners for pictures, for example, really object to having their pictures used for training. And that's going to be an area of very active legal battle, right? So data moats might be kind of one complementary asset they could think about. But another thing I think that has been kind of hidden under the radar are kind of complementary technologies, right? So one thing that's been interesting is that Facebook is a lot more open. Even before they had Llama, they had another model called OPT, and where the O stands for open. And you can get everything on GitHub about this model, right? And in particular, what you can get are their logbooks. They basically taken a very, very kind of like very detailed account of all the things that went wrong or that were difficult in the training phase of the model, right? And so this is what it looks like if you go to GitHub, the chronicles of OPT development. And then if you click on one of those reports, you get a sense that they're using a lot of complementary technologies, right? To actually manage to train the model, which is and manage both the hardware and software access. And this seems to be, this seems to be craft-like, right? There's a lot of mistakes you can do along the way. And so the question, and I don't know the answer to that question, but it's I think a very, very important question, right? Is there in the kind of details of implementing the training of those technologies, the seed of a complementary asset that some companies might actually hold on very tightly, which would prevent competitors to really reach the state of the art, right? If you think about the example of Google versus Bing, right, you might suspect that this is going to be true in generative AI as well, right? Meaning that, Bing may not be very far behind Google, but that amount that they're behind is in some sense a very big deal in terms of dominance in the marketplace. So I'm not saying this is correct, but I think it's at least not implausible, and so something that we should monitor closely. Okay. And with that, I'm going to stop and pass the baton to my colleague Ezra, who is going to tell us about value delivery.
Thanks, Pierre. This has been a lot of fun. My first one of these, really a lot of fun. Great, you got my slide up there. Yeah, so value creation, value capture can be thought of as Pierre has been doing as sort of from the standpoint of a very, relatively simple organization. Though we all know, so if you're a startup and you're about trying to commercialize a new technology and then maybe like Pierre was saying, appropriated based on innovation or development of complementary assets, those things are not easy to do organizationally. But where a set of really challenging questions that usually comes up is when you're talking about incumbent firms, right? The term that we use when we're thinking about somehow there's existing set of firms that are impacted by a new innovation, new technology. How they might respond. And in the background, I think, is I'd say the influence of Joseph Schumpeter and his notion of capitalism's gales of creative destruction. And that various conversations or the terminology that's been used over the recent decades for thinking about what happens when there is a new S-curve that represents a discontinuity, a transition, a disruption, that can create that often leads to new winners and losers, new dominant firms in a new stage of the game versus the old one, though. But sometimes actually creates new opportunities, and we have all kinds of stories for each of those. And it's a very active area of research for people like Pierre and me and our colleagues, an active area of teaching to try to reckon with how this all shakes out. And so there's a breakdown of questions on this slide. So the organizational questions in particular about how incumbent firms might respond to, hopefully even not just respond, but anticipate to a transition and discontinuity so that they can leverage what they have already to succeed and not be confined to sort of the dustbin of history in one way or another. And so this is, major area of focus right now is trying to understand how this is all going to shake out, but also trying to understand the various strategies that we're seeing in this space. Really, really interesting space. And I don't know the answers to any of this, but I'll give you a sense from our frameworks for how we might organize our thinking about it, just as Pierre has done with her value creation and value capture. And so here's a breakdown of some of the questions we might think about. On that previous slide, yes, so Pierre's trying to now guess which slide I'm talking about for the moment. Right, and so Pierre gave us the notion of complementary assets, and we're going to be thinking about, in some sense, since the innovation is completely new, the big question is really with respect to complementary assets. How relevant are the complementary assets that have been built up? And Pierre already gave us one really, really useful way to think about it in terms of these data moats. Maybe they didn't even know in building up. So, and there's some nice suggestions in the chat. Bloomberg and pharma, in addition to Salesforce, which Pierre had mentioned. You might discover that an asset you've built up over time and didn't know that it had value, all of a sudden has new value as potentially the basis for a competitive advantage in this new space, these data moats, as Pierre mentioned. But there are also existing complementary assets. They might be the basis for leveraging, but they also might be a hindrance. And so we want to think about in ways in which they might actually be, hinder success rather than facilitate it. One way to think about the organizational problem is in terms of ambidexterity. That's a term that's due to Michael Tushman and Charles O'Reilly. Can we do both the old and the new at the same time? The old business and the new business leads to all kinds of tricky questions and how this is all going to affect competitive outcomes. So Pierre, if you can advance. One way to just build on what Pierre was doing is to think about, and this is often done by strategy professors, is think about not just one S-curve, but a succession of S-curves. And here's just one very familiar example that I'm using because it's one that's familiar to any of us. Those of us who are Generation Xers have lived through each of these stages, may even remember before there were video stores. What this history sensitizes to is a few things, right? So one is, just like in this industry that we're seeing kind of building, you'll notice how the S-curves are drawn in such a way that the new S-curve is sort of underperforming. The new technology is underperforming relative to the old technology at first, but then it gets better and maybe supplants it. That's a very common pattern. My own experience with ChatGPT so far has been, at first, frustration. They can't even do math. It's crazy, right? But then actually started to warm up to some things that it could potentially do. I'm not a lead user of these kinds of technologies in general. The other thing that this sensitizes us to is both how these transitions can be the basis for our threats, right? So there are no more video stores anymore, no more Blockbuster, but also opportunities, right? And so you saw Netflix, which was, the king of a brief moment of mail order CDs, leverage their complementary assets, which were, we could have a long conversation about that, but in short, they had a relationship with their customer, knowledge of their customer that they could leverage to get into content creation, which was a big change at the heart of the new streaming industry. I'll say also, though, another thing that's interesting to think about that we've seen is, at first, it seemed like there were moats in streaming. Right now, it seems fairly commoditized with very intense competition, with also maybe too much entry relative to what the market could support. That may be some of what we're seeing in this area as well. It may be that basically all this entry into generative AI might lead to a much more competitive market and a less profitable one for the players that then might otherwise, if it weren't so hot, in other words. Okay. The scenario up here, if you could advance. Yeah. One way to think about these issues, right? So we have these existing complementary assets. One way to break down the question of whether an incumbent firm is likely to be successful or not, and what kinds of problems it's likely to face, is to distinguish between, so we have complementary assets from the old stage of a game, right, and the existing S-curve, and we can break it down into, do those old complementary assets, even if they are relevant, and you can see how they might be the basis for creating and capturing value, at least in principle, right? What's their relationship to the old business, right? So if we leverage them into the new space, do they extend that old business, or do they threaten that old business? And so, and this here I'm drawing on really great research by colleagues of ours, Tim Bresnahan, Shane Greenstein, Rebecca Henderson, on this issue. And you can distinguish between cases like, now it's easy, we all kind of know the Kodak story with digital, though we think we know it. We actually talked about this in our teaching, and we derive lessons from it that are not obvious. But if you take a stage back, we don't, we take for granted that Kodak was really successful in what was a major transformation of the industry from black and white to color, right? And if you look back at that, you can see that that was a transformation that extended their existing franchise, right? So it was a chemical engineering powerhouse before in black and white, and it would continue to be a chemical engineering powerhouse in various parts of the value chain as well. It was extendable. And so maybe not as big a surprise that they didn't have as much challenge. In fact, it was opportunity, and they extend the business. Whereas, yes, it's true that IBM was successful in launching the personal computer, but then they ran into a lot of trouble, famously ran into a lot of trouble, leading, and the market then kind of got away from them. Ended up being that market dominated by the platform owners in open architecture, which was Microsoft and Intel. And what seems to have been at the root of the problem was internal competition between, as the question was, what was going to be the lead business? Was it going to be the PC, or was it going to be the mainframe? And that leads to major organizational questions. It is very tough to be ambidextrous when the right hand and the left hand are essentially competing with each other. Yeah, there we go. And Pierre, if you could advance, one way that strategy professors like to think about this, we certainly do in our teaching, is that is to think about this in terms of a trade-off between coordination and initiative. And this is a trade-off that we see even within divisions within companies, but certainly between divisions of companies, and maybe in particular when companies are trying to do, again, sort of run their old business while getting into something new. When you're getting into something new, you kind of want to have the culture of a startup and the incentives of a startup, where you are, you have a high degree of market responsiveness, a high degree of autonomy, a high degree of initiative. You live or die, right? You eat what you kill based on this opportunity. And in that kind of environment, if you've got to check in with other units, other businesses that are not focused on that opportunity, don't live or die with that opportunity, it is a drag on your operation. Yeah, it can, whether that's checking in laterally with other divisions within the same company, or whether it's checking with corporate, the more this kind of coordination you do, the more sand in the gears that you're that you may face. Very, very general problem, a very hard problem, but particularly a problem when the existing business and the new business are basically at odds with each other, are competing with each other internally. And so, Pierre, if you could advance, that makes it very difficult. We do have many cases, though, where when you've got a strategy where the new business is extending that old business, so again, Kodak, black and white versus color, but many existing businesses have this flavor. When it's an opportunity, that moderates that trade-off between the existing business and the new business. And what it means to coordinate now actually means I'm getting assets that are useful in pursuing that new opportunity, and I can pursue it better. And maybe the existing business is actually helped by that new business in one way or another, rather than being threatened by it. If I am in a legacy business that can be helped by that new technology, that new innovation, I'm much more amenable, if I'm running that business, to helping out my colleagues who are in the new business. It's more of a win-win kind of situation. And so while there's always a trade-off between coordination and initiative, it always adds some drag when I have to coordinate. It also potentially is actually complementary with my initiative over the long term, at least, if I can see that. And so those things can be complements rather than substitutes. It moderates that trade-off. And so one reason I share this with you is if you think about what we're seeing competitively, in particular, if you look at the Google versus Microsoft slash OpenAI, the difference in their strategies. And what I share with you, I think helps us to understand some of what we're seeing. At least it throws out some reasonable hypotheses for what we're seeing, right? So why is Google, relatively conservative in what they're doing? Well, they're protecting their existing franchise, right? They would also presumably have some challenges, right? So, we saw some announcements yesterday that I think show them being a little more aggressive, perhaps, but they're definitely late in some respects, and certainly they're not, being as aggressive in redoing their search business as Microsoft is. From Microsoft's perspective, you can see why, if you're running the Bing business, you're much more in this, you're seeing the relation between coordination and initiative with respect to, say, OpenAI, that collaboration, or the parts of Microsoft that are running that collaboration. You're seeing much less sand in the gears and much more openness to the kind of coordination that is reflected on the slide, because you think actually, hey, we are, to go back to what Pierre was sharing earlier, we're to call Bing an also-ran relative to Google would be something of a compliment, right? It's not really part of anyone's consideration set, or hasn't been until recently. It's not the foundation for one of the most lucrative businesses in recent capitalist history, right? Which is Google's advertising business. And so it's all opportunity, all upside from the Bing's perspective, from Microsoft's perspective. And so they're going to be really open to considering various kinds of things. They're going to be less conservative, and they're going to have a much easier time coordinating internally. Whereas you can sort of see what Google's doing in terms of having a separate business, something of a skunk works, for its for development of generative AI and its conservatism. And there are various stories in corporate history where that conservatism has led to a lot of innovation that's not necessarily captured by the incumbent. I'm not saying this is not an indictment of Google's strategy here. It's more of some thoughts about how we might explain the differences in those strategies using these value delivery frameworks. So I think we've got some time left for questions, and I don't know where we are in the Q&A.
Ezra, I've been answering questions as you were speaking.
Okay, go ahead.
But no, I mean, I think that's very interesting. If we're thinking about Google versus Microsoft, I think there are kind of a number of conjectures, right, that we could have, right? So one is, as you were saying, Google is going to be much less afraid about Microsoft is going to be much less afraid about cannibalizing its current offering, right, in search, for example, than Google is going to be, because they are, as you said, an also-ran, or maybe not even an also-ran, right? On the other hand, you might think that it is possible to serve advertising alongside the results of chat sessions, right? In which case, the extent to which this new S-curve is going to depreciate the complementary assets of Google is very much into question. It's not clear to me that that's the case. I think it's very much open at this stage. So I think one thing that is another conjecture that you might have has to do with much more with kind of internal organizational dynamics within Google, right? They seem to, they have had a very large research efforts in this area, right? Remember, they introduced the transformer architecture, right? The moment of dominant design came from Google. And so to me, that this story, if it had to echo through history, I'm thinking of Xerox PARC.
Right.
Right. I think as many of our listeners will remember, Xerox introduced the graphical user interface and the mouse and all of those things that they never knew what to do with. Right. And other players in the industry ended up profiting from those ideas. So is this a repeat of that episode, or is this something genuinely new? Right. It might also be that we're talking about a marathon here, not a sprint. And we are over indexing on like 3 months of competitive battle when, to shake out things are going to take, 3 or maybe even 10 years. I think we need to kind of remain extremely cautious. Personally, I wish I'd be a fly on the wall in lots of internal meetings
say the same thing.
at Google to kind of think about, what are the true reasons behind their hesitation. Right?
Yeah, I full agreement. And Xerox PARC is the classic example of, it's, I think, I'd say during the 2000s, I'm not sure exactly why, it became very common to, and I won't name names as to where this came from, but prescribe, some kind of separate division for developing, for basic research or for things that would be otherwise snuffed out by the existing business. And that flows directly from that coordination initiative trade-off. Like you're gonna, the existing business is gonna be sand in the gears for that development. The flip side, though, as we know, is that you can develop a lot of things and it doesn't actually get into the business and commercialized. And so that makes it quite tricky. And it certainly fits the pattern that we're talking about. And like I said, you can also think about attempts like IBM with PCs, or another great example is General Motors in trying to play catch up with the Toyota in particular, but Japanese major success in leading up to the 80s in inroads in market share by developing the Saturn division. The fact that it was developed outside of the main division actually led to problems later on, and internal competition, organizational problems. I would love to. So yeah, the one thing I was going to say, Pierre, is this is a different industry. It is one that both technologically allows itself for more experimentation, for cheap experimentation than was true in the past, in making a transition like this. And so you got to believe that Google is looking for all kinds of ways to experiment along with A/B testing of various kinds in around the questions that you're asking. What can it do in changing its the interface and the search experience that allows it to see whether it can build a bridge between its existing interface and functionality and this AI enhanced one.
Right. And going back to the first point you were making, right? It's kind of interesting that Microsoft has sought to integrate ChatGPT into Bing, whereas Google has kept Bard, right? Bard is its own interface.
Yeah.
Right. It is not integrated with search. They've been very resistant to kind of play with it. They're advancing very gingerly.
I can't think of any other explanation other than what we're talking about. Right. There's that tension. Right. And I think you're saying, one thing we talk about a lot when we're engaged with these questions with our students, right, is how much of this is sort of rational and strategic. And so it's sort of very defensible based on what they're losing, what they're risking, what they're how much of it is a little more behavioral and organizational, and maybe an emotional at some level, right? Which is, there's something about what the user interface looks like right now that you got to believe that there's an attachment to, that if you're Google and you've grown up, building a business around it, that is going to be hard to move away from. But that's hard to know without being inside. Yeah.
So our participant Kathy here is telling us that a top investors at a recent MIT event claimed that recent Y Combinator startups were obsolete the moment that GPT-4 got launched. And I guess I want to piggyback on that. It's so first, it's interesting that if you look at the most recent crop of Y Combinator, there are a lot of AI startups in the lot. But I would say that in general, you hear a lot of pundits making very, very grand pronouncements about generative AI and what the future holds, right? And it goes from nothing much is going to change, it's all incremental, don't believe the hype, right? I guess that's the Ezra approach, maybe. To humanity is going to come to an end, right? The Skynet moment.
Luckily, it's outside of the scope of our expertise.
Exactly. I think that one thing we wanted to illustrate with this webinar is that the questions are a lot more important than the answers. I think both of us, right? We're going to take grand pronouncements uttered with an air of certainty about what the future holds with a big grain of salt. But we believe, maybe wrongly, we believe that the questions were worth asking, those you can kind of try to figure out by careful and systematic application of intellectual frameworks that have stood the test of time. And so that was the spirit of what we wanted to talk about today. That's the spirit of the class that we're teaching. And in general, I think that's the way in which we and our other colleagues at the Sloan School of Management think about, how to tackle kind of very current events and try to kind of make them relevant to your current situation or business.
Well said, Pierre. That's a great place which to conclude. Unfortunately, we could keep on going for quite a while on this. It's great stuff.
Yep. Okay. Pierre, Ezra, thank you. Pierre, if I could ask you just to advance the slide one more time. You mentioned the program developing and managing a successful technology strategy. You can hear more about creating, capturing, and delivering value. And in the way very much that we teach of mind in hand, it's intended for you to apply directly to your own businesses as well. So this program next runs live online on Zoom at the end of June, and then in person in October on the MIT campus. You've got a QR code to scan to access the site, and I've just put the link to the program to register in the chat. So thank you all. Elaine, any closing remarks we have?
All right. No, thank you, Eric. Thanks to everyone for participating. And we hope to see many of you in our course.
Definitely. Yes. Right. Thanks, Eric. Thanks to the Sloan team.
All right.
Privilege.
Second that.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.